Welcome to the show, Ben Winks. It's so nice to have you here. Just to introduce you a little bit, as far as I'm concerned, you're one of South Africa's most prominent legal minds and legal thinkers, especially in the space of constitutional law, human rights law. I see that you're very well versed. I believe you have an LLM in international law as well. You are quite an outspoken person in terms of you often lend advice to news agencies and press releases and that kind of thing. And you've become quite a valuable player in the South African legal profession. I only know one other person like you. His name's George Khan. He works for Richard Spoor. And I would describe the two of you as being quite confident, humble combatants. And the reason that I use that term is because people in your position, advocates like you, advocates like Richard Spoor, advocates like George Winks, that's your brother, advocates like George Khan, they go to court and basically they are the people that are keeping the wolf from the door. They are the last line of conflict and combat before things turn violent. And as a result of that, you guys play a particularly special role in the South African landscape. I think that we have one of the best legal professions in the world. So lawyers and courts and that kind of thing are often getting shut down in South Africa in terms of their reputation. People complain about the police, they complain about lawyers, but the truth is that we've arrived in one of the best functioning democracies, modern democracies in the world. In any case, as a doctrine, it functions quite well, or it's very good. And the reason that we're here and that we're not plunged into a civil war right now is because of lawyers. It's because the legal profession stood up in South Africa during the apartheid era, and they helped lead us through. And you are the next generation. Guys like you, guys like Richard Spoor are now the next generation taking up the flag, leading South Africa through troubled waters to avoid conflict, to instill justice, and to make South Africa just a more fair and equitable place. And there must be some history. There has to be something about you. What is it about your past that has given you the ability to, A, withstand the tension, the anxiety, the stress of undertaking your job? Because it must be. It's simply, I refuse to believe that lawyers going to court or advocates going to court over big court cases don't in some ways experience the same pressures that maybe a professional sportsman experiences at a World Cup final or a boxer experiences in a big title fight. And I would like to know from you, what is it about your history, maybe about somebody in your family or about somebody that you used to look up to? How is it that you came to be a South African bastion, essentially, of morals and ethics and of the rule of law? Give us a little bit of insight into what builds a Ben Winks. If there's somebody out there that's looking up to you now saying, I want to do law, I want to do the right thing, I want to play a role in South Africa's future. Explain to me the history that you had, who you used to look up to, how you got to where you want to be, and what are the psychological credentials that you think you have that others may need to develop if they want to be in that space.
Well, firstly, thanks very much for the very kind introduction. It begins really with my parents. My brothers and I were raised with the idea that you're on earth to serve others. That was really their overarching philosophy, was service to others and service to humankind. Had a strong sense of a need to uplift those less fortunate and to stand up for people who can't stand up for themselves. I learned when I was in high school about obviously Nelson Mandela. He was a lawyer. He helped a lot of underprivileged people when he was practicing law, and learnt about the lawyers who had defended him and other political activists in the treason trial and the Rivonia trial. In particular, someone like George Bizos was an inspiration to me. He had also represented the Biko family in the inquest into the killing of Steve Biko in detention. And I was interested in three possible careers. I was interested in either journalism, film production, or the law. And eventually I just followed my gut to study law, and immediately had the reassurance, from the first month that this is what I want to do. And was always attracted to the public law type of subjects, the legal spheres that serve the public interests, constitutional law, human rights law, international law. Those were always my favorite subjects. I never had any attraction to the commercial law side of things. And I was initially had a kind of academic direction. I was on a track to be an academic in international and constitutional law. And then I found myself then increasingly attracted to practicing law, and did my articles, became an attorney, learnt tremendous forensic skills, particularly from a media law attorney called Dario Milo. But I had always really wanted to be an advocate rather than an attorney. I wanted to argue in court, and that then eventually, 6 years ago, I made the leap. 6 or 7 years ago, I made the leap to become an advocate, where you're really working for yourself, and you're not a salaried employee anymore like you are when you're an attorney. So it's quite stressful from that perspective. It's also stressful when you have, the weight of a client's fortunes, or their, whether they're going to have a place to sleep.
Yeah, in some ways you live vicariously through their stress.
Yeah, and that's a lot of pressure when you're the one presenting to the judge. The rest of the team do a lot of work, but the things you say can really determine the outcome, and can determine whether somebody gets justice or not. So that's tremendously stressful. But I think having a sense of purpose helps a lot with managing that kind of stress. You always remember what you're doing and why you're doing it. And having a family as well, that kind of support system also helps tremendously to manage the pressure. When I started practicing as an advocate, I made the decision that I would structure my work around my family rather than the other way around. And that helps me very much to have the space to recharge and to stay grounded.
To have a little bit of balance is obviously really important to regulate stress and tension. It's amazing because when I look at people like yourself and Richard Spoor, I know that you guys could have gone into private corporate law, and you guys could have been billionaires driving around in Ferraris and doing that whole thing. And I cannot tell you how much I admire that you've basically turned around and said, I'm going to stand here and I'm going to go and fight tooth and nail for the little guy. I just find it to be incredibly impressive. George Khan, he does the same thing a number of years ago. Somebody I know close to him said to him, you could be earning a lot more money, and the guy just didn't care. He said, I'm happy doing and that I cannot tell you what an impressive statement that is. Just an impressive statement towards humanity, an impressive gesture towards humanity, I would say. So that's just incredible. And then the other thing I would like to ask you is, when you're in court, because you've basically, from the time you went from an attorney to an advocate, you were frontline for some of the biggest court cases in the country. I switched the television on one day. I knew you when you were still at school. I was a first-year student, and I switched on the television one day, and you like standing there like next to like Themba Ngugai, Toby, and you are like, I was just like, wow. Again, just a very impressive accomplishment in a very small space of time, which in some way must speak to your academic might. But I want to know, when you look at a court case and there's that quiet calmness about the advocates in the room, and they deliver their information with not too much passion, it's quite calculated. what actually is going on in your mind, in the mind of the advocate or the attorney that's in that courtroom? Is it a little bit like a boxer where it might look calmer on the outside than what's going on in your head? Talk us through that. What is it actually like to be front and center in front of a big judge, delivering in front of a televised court case on a very complicated matter? Talk us through the psychological aspects of that.
The first thing is preparation. There's hours and hours and hours of preparation that goes before the court appearance. And you refine your strategy and the substance of your argument already in the court papers that get exchanged and the written argument. And then obviously the oral argument is a very important feature of winning or losing a case. And it's important to have that clinical and clear articulation of the case and deconstruction of your opponent's case. But there is a lot going on under the surface. Your mind is racing. The judges ask you questions that you don't necessarily expect, and you have to just adapt your argument accordingly. So it's not like you prepare a speech and you deliver the speech. The point of the oral argument is for the judges to get assistance from the advocates and to ask difficult questions, which you have to address as nimbly as you possibly can, without detracting from the clarity of your case. And that's really the main challenge in oral argument. You can prepare as much as you want, but you have to have a very clear idea of the justice of your case so that the judge can then be attracted to the most just solution.
That's fascinating insight. Basically, what I'm getting is that once you get to your sort of level in the profession, you might be a little bit like a Bongi Mbonambi, where you're on the field and there's chaos around you, but you're kind of cool, calm, collected. You know where you are going. A bit of a massive evolution on a first moot court, as an example. So I think that's very interesting that you basically have suggested to me that you kind of build up fortitude, a psychological and mental fortitude for this kind of thing. And perhaps a younger, less experienced advocate might not be able to handle those pressures as easily, and that would detract from performance of the job.
Yeah, that's why it's important to get experience as a junior to the best advocates you can. So I've been very fortunate to have worked with Wim Trengove, Kate Hofmeyer, Faisal Ismail, Tembeka Ngukatobi, and many others who, took me under their wing and helped me to get that experience. And every time I'm a junior to them, I learn something new. And, every time I perform on my own as an advocate, I think I need to... You review your own performance and you think how you could have done it better. It'll come with experience, but it's learning from those other advocates, even your opponents, how more effective you can be with different techniques. So that's really, it's just a matter of experience and being open to learn from those more senior.
That's very interesting. I'm sure that there's a lot of young people out there that aspire to take up a career like yours that could potentially be listening now, and that's valuable information for them. We have some kind of shared history to some extent. We were both scouts, Boy Scouts in South Africa, and there was a time when Scouts was quite a significant institution in the country, and it did a lot of good. And the reason that I'm segueing into this segment is that I would like to talk to you about the breakdown of the upholding of rights, human rights, basic human rights inside institutions and organizations in South Africa, such as religious institutions, scouts, schools. And the reason I raise this is because in the last decade or so, especially with the popular rise of social media, we very often hear of these institutions becoming fundamentally just corrupt, mismanaged, or just a lot of unethical behavior that takes place in them. So we've heard of top boarding schools, for example, private boarding schools where there's been child abuse going on. It's something that I worry about hugely inside institutions like the Boy Scouts, given the nature of what's happened in America over the last 10 or 15 years with all that kind of information being released and all those kinds of court cases. And I would just like to ask you your view on the breakdown of these institutions in terms of these places being safe spaces where children's rights are upheld, because that's ultimately the idea, is that you send your child to a school and it is a place where all their rights are upheld and fulfilled as best as possible. And it seems that we are having institutional breakdowns in these places, and I was wondering if there's some kind of advice that you could give as to how we can fortify these institutions in the future so that they are once again institutions that uphold rights instead of becoming places where they are ground to nothing.
I think I see it a little differently in the sense that we're seeing a lot of revelations about abuse and bullying and other malpractices in these kinds of institutions in the last few years. But in many of these institutions, these things were actually happening 20, 30, 40 years ago. And there have been some people coming forward with those revelations. I think you and I were very lucky that the scout groups that we belonged to, there weren't those kinds of abuses. There were issues like, you would learn, or you'd be exposed to a lot of misogynistic attitudes, homophobic attitudes, and those kinds of things you have to then undergo a process of unlearning. I think that in some senses those things are getting better the more people are exposed to a sensitivity to difference. But there is I agree with you that there is a need to reinforce some of the foundations of these institutions to get, I think proper oversight certainly helps, proper involvement of parents in particular can help to prevent a lot of abuses. As I say, you and I think we're very lucky that we belong to strong institutions where we didn't have any of those abuses, but I think there were other groups that did suffer from those. So I think it's a matter of also empowering the youngsters to speak up and being upfront about, what their rights are, and making it very clear to them what is acceptable and unacceptable behavior that they should stand up against, whether it's done by adults or by their peers. I think that would be a very strong way to cultivate that sense of standing up against abuses, standing up against bullying, standing up against bigotry.
It's very interesting that you say this. I've been advocating for a number of years now, going back to around 2016, to have the Bill of Rights taught at a school level, to have two courses, where at around Standard 1, you would get a basic course on the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. And again, at Standard 6, you get a more advanced course on the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, so that it's taught all the way through the schools. And I think that could lend a hand in some way to help children or people that are in vulnerable positions to be empowered and know their rights. And I just think it's absolutely madness that we live in a country with what I would argue is the perhaps or arguably the most advanced, most rational democratic doctrine that's ever been created. It's certainly way better than what the Americans have to deal with. And I just was never able to get it off the ground. People used to think that I was mad. I even offered to go into schools, even though I'm not a lawyer, and do basic lectures for free. With a educational psychologist as an example, go in as a team. And I made this offer for free to about 10 schools in and around Joburg, and not a single one took me up. I had one school principal who said to me, "You're too much of a risk. You're the risk." Which I found to be somewhat amusing. But that's very interesting insight. I think they should be teaching more rights. These institutions should be on cameras. There should be more cameras at school. Systems to monitor, who's passing in and out of door locks, for example, and that kind of thing. Very important in these institutions.
I think another issue with schools in particular, but also churches and other institutions, is that when abuses are discovered, they get sort of brushed under the carpet.
Yes.
Because the school doesn't want to get, go through litigation at the CCMA or whatever. So it's discovered that a sports coach, for example, or a housemaster has been using corporal punishment. And the thing goes away quietly. It doesn't get reported to the South African Council of Education. And then you find the same person pops up at another school and carries on doing the same thing. And these individuals circulate and influence the culture at these schools. And you do get this culture of impunity for, in particular, corporal punishment, but also other types of abuse of power by adults against children. And obviously, the Catholic Church is something that suffered from that for generations, where things were brushed under the carpet. People never got reported. And that allows this culture of impunity to get entrenched and does a lot of generational harm.
I personally believe that it's taking place inside other religious institutions. So I know for a fact that it's taking place inside Catholic religious institutions. I don't want to get sued. I don't want to have to contact you to defend me in court. But I'm absolutely certain as a social scientist that if you create the right conditions, it's like a petri dish for bacteria, that if you create the right conditions, those kinds of behaviors are going to manifest. And the conditions in other religious institutions, not just in South Africa, but globally, have very, very similar structures, principles, and just ways and modes of being that are so similar, it would almost be ridiculous to think it's not happening inside other religious faculties. They may be smaller, they may be more insular, they may be better at hushing things up and keeping them under the carpet. But I have a feeling in the next 10, 15 years, we're going to start entering a wave that gets kicked off by lawsuits like the Catholic Church in the States, like Boy Scouts in the US again, where we might start to see this kind of thing kick off in South Africa. We've already seen it emerge with some private schools and some government schools as well. There's one just down the road here, I don't want to mention names, but I mean, they've had, 10 separate incidents in with different people over 20 years now, still unable to sort the problem out. So I would say that there's generally been a breakdown in South Africa. There's been two things. In the post-apartheid era, there was wonderful growth. So we had amazing inclusion and we did much better. But in some senses, we've dropped the ball with upholding our institutions. So we've included a far bigger population, which is ideal. But in some ways, the qualities of our educational institutions, of our religious institutions, I feel have, in relation to the high standard and the high holding of South Africa's Bill of Rights, have deteriorated negatively. And that segues me into the next question, which has to do with the influence of the body politic or of politics in South Africa and how they have come to reshape educational institutions in South Africa. And you've obviously had a very significant education inside legal faculty, so you'll understand the university systems quite well in South Africa. And I feel that our universities are not as robust spaces for human development as they should be. And I think a large part of this is the negative influence of politics inside these institutions, particularly at a university level. And I would just like to ask what your feeling is on how politics shapes education in South Africa, and what outcomes these have for the rule of law and for democracy in South Africa. For example, one of the things that I've personally witnessed with my own eyes was the capturing of student bodies, say like SRCs inside the universities. So while I was at Rhodes, for example, you had universities that, big political organizations that were quietly funding members of the SRC, and they were actually capturing these institutions, and they were pushing out a lot, just as an example, of socialist doctrine, communist doctrine, and that sort of thing. And a lot of people are starting to say that we are now fighting a war, particularly in the humanities in South Africa, and to some extent in environments like the legal educational fraternity, that we are now fighting a war, an ideological war in these institutions between socialist, communist ideology that reflects in some way with the ANC's hopes and ambitions for the future, against the development and upholding of democracy? Or do you think that this is just part of a vibrant democracy?
Yeah, so I mean, universities are a very interesting site of contestation, because the original idea of a university is that it's run by the faculty, by the academics themselves. And what we've seen over the past 15 years at least is a shift to managerial universities. Some have called it the rise of the disciplinary university, where it's increasingly run by bureaucrats and administrators. It's not run from the bottom up by faculty, by academics. They're not self-governing academics anymore, where you have a vibrant contestation of ideas. It is more about bureaucrats governing from the top down, putting a lot of pressure on academics to produce outputs, research outputs, and also pass rates of an increasing number of students, rather than doing core academic work, which is to present challenging ideas, to be public intellectuals, to shape the public discourse, and to confront the challenges of the day. One, they're too preoccupied with bureaucratic, administrative type of work. And the other is that their free speech is substantially curbed because universities have used instruments of discipline, and this has been across the country, because they've been put into these top-down managerial structures, that if you don't toe the line, you get disciplined or marginalized in other ways as an academic, which violates UNESCO principles of academic freedom, articles of academic freedom that have been adopted in the US and elsewhere. For example, you can't criticize your own institution without facing the risk of disciplinary consequences. So you have this chilling effect on academics. Academics are cowed into compliance and towing the line. One of those things I think does relate, there is ideological contestation in a lot of universities, and you see at various universities a push by mainly black academics to decolonize, to confront colonial legacies in the curriculum and the like, and a very intense pushback by the more, let's call them center-right or even right-wing academics and managers and bureaucrats to shut down that kind of expression of academic freedom. The same, of course, applies to the students, where you have the center-right and right-wing resistance to movements like Rhodes Must Fall and Fees Must Fall, and again using disciplinary instruments to shut those down. It's, I think the content of the ideologies should be as wide as possible. I think that every idea should have its place and should be able to compete for ascendancy. But it should never be imposed from government or bureaucracy on an institution. I think that's where we start to face risks to academic freedom, which of course feeds into the professions and the arts and all kinds of areas of human endeavor.
It's very interesting that you say this, because I consider, look, there's obviously certain fundamental pillars of democracy, but I consider journalism and academia, especially at a tertiary level, to be the last pillar of democracy. I consider those two to be absolutely fundamental because one acts as the thinking tank for free thought, and the other one acts as a loudspeaker or a voice for that kind of free thought that grows of those institutions. And what you've described to me now is a move towards top-down centralization of power in the tertiary education, in the university and technicon education systems, which follows exactly the ANC's. I know this is not about criticizing the ANC. I'm not getting into that on the show now, but it's to say that this follows their principle. This has been something that they have basically done in all spheres of government, where they've tried to continually and increasingly centralize power within their own institution and make everything a kind of top-down command. It almost comes straight from the KGB handbook. To some extent, I'm not a conspiracy theorist. I was wondering if there's anywhere else that you see this top-down centralization of command. I don't know if you perhaps see it in the courts. I know that it's definitely happening in the police stations and in the security cluster, inside certain elements of the security cluster. Is this something that you see in our courts?
Not a great deal in the courts, at least in the high courts. In magistrates' courts that are relatively politically controlled, because they fall under the Department of Justice, they're not as independent as you have at high court level. You can see, there's a vulnerability to political direction, but because they don't really deal with political cases, it's not too much of an issue in the magistrates' court level. But what you do find is the ANC, of course, in 1994 was confronted with, and it set out in its Ready to Govern and its blueprint for the National Democratic Revolution, the challenge of transforming institutions that were overwhelmingly male and white and bigoted. There was, and to some extent in some institutions, still is actually, a need to transform not only the representation in these institutions to make them more legitimate in South Africa, where the majority of the population are black or people of color and are historically maltreated. But also a change of mindset to the kind of constitutional project that we have, a country founded on human dignity, equality, and freedom. And that, of course, because of the need, the imperative to transform these institutions, that created an attractive opportunity for any political party, you'd see it in other countries as well, to deploy compliant or pliable individuals rather than those committed necessarily to the constitutional project, those committed to a particular party project. But because of the way the appointments to judicial office are designed, the risk of that, which was there was a great deal of wise foresight in that design, you do find that political deployments to the courts have not been a major feature of our last 30 years, which is something we can be very grateful for. We do have an independent judiciary, and it has played an important role in as a bulwark against the erosion of the rule of law.
I've always been very confident in our higher courts in South Africa, the SCA, the Concourt, the High Courts. I have always been, or at least for the last decade, a huge critic of our magistrates' courts in South Africa. Again, as a social science, I have to look at the conditions created in the petri dish. And when you have a look at police stations on a local level, They are incompetent to a large extent. They are corrupt. They are mismanaged. And I often find that there's just a handful of good police officers in each of these organizations that are out there trying to do an honest job with their heart in the right place. These people are under-resourced. They don't get enough support. And I think overwhelmingly, one would have to consider that because the relationships between magistrates, courts, and local police stations are fairly close, one would have to assume that the rot has leaked into these places, especially in more outlying areas. I simply refuse to believe that some of our lower courts are not captured, that some of our magistrates are not being bribed. I've got no evidence of this. I've never seen it with my own eyes. But again, when you make the conditions correct or just right inside the petri dish, these kinds of things start to manifest. And I was wondering if you've ever experienced anything along these lines during your career, if you have any concerns about this thing, or if I'm just wrong, if I'm just plain not right about this.
No, there definitely are problems at magistrates court level. Fortunately, you don't find that political issues are really dealt with at magistrates court level. It's the high courts that deal with that. So from a judicial independence perspective, there's not too much to worry about. But there is corruption. There have been cases of magistrates being bribed. There have been cases of magistrates who get appointed despite having criminal charges against them. Magistrates who deliver the most appalling judgments in rape cases and the like. And they don't get properly addressed, these issues. The Magistrates Commission doesn't do promptly or at all what it should be doing to address bribery in the magistracy, abuse of power and plain incompetence, bad judicial work. And that's a serious problem that needs to be looked at. And there also needs to be more attention given to judicial appointments. You know, we see on TV and the internet the interviews for judges, and there's a lot of attention on that by academics and professionals and the like. But we never hear anything about the process for appointing magistrates. There's no, news interest in it. And that is a problem, because that's how many unsuitable people do become magistrates.
For me, the magistrates' courts are where the bulk of justice is actually delivered in South Africa. The vast majority of South Africans will never be able to, what's at the minimum, 100,000 rand threshold, whatever it is, to hit a high court. Given the state of South Africa's economy, I mean, a high court is just well beyond the means of most South Africans. So I have to say, it is quite distressing to get confirmation that the magistrates' courts aren't working as well as they should, especially if you consider the synergy between the dysfunctional police stations and the somewhat dysfunctional courts. It's a serious concern for South Africa, and I think it's one of the things that I would like to hear a political party come up and campaign on heavily and say, we're having these issues. Dispensation of justice in South Africa is stifled because of this, and have some kind of political agenda on it. And I'm just amazed that I've never heard this kind of thing. It's like you say, our politicians, they talk about, the bench of Supreme Court justices and that kind of thing. It's very popular. But the lower courts, to some extent, they kind of, it's almost like an outlying rural public hospital. Sometimes you kind of get the feeling that they're just left to their own devices. I've lived in a number of small towns, and you drive past these courts, haven't been painted in 40 years. And, if you can't raise the flag outside properly and paint the building every decade, I must say I'm seriously concerned about the quality of justice administrated in these various institutions. Just to go back to the legal profession in South Africa, there was a time when the ANC had the A team. It was guys like Nelson Mandela and Thabo Mbeki, and these guys were brilliantly educated, and they really helped develop the doctrine of human rights in South Africa. And I would just like to know from you whether or not you feel we're now dealing with the B team of the legal profession in South Africa the same way we're dealing with the B team of political leaders. Has the quality of our legal dispensation and our dispensation of justice deteriorated in the court systems? I'm not talking about the police, I'm just talking about the court systems.
I think that the top lawyers are as good as they ever were. As good as your Sydney Kentridges and Arthur Chaskelsons. I think we still have that brilliant quality of lawyers at the top. You do get, you see cases of lawyers getting suspended or struck from the role of practicing attorneys or advocates for a variety of misconduct. And the Legal Practice Council, I think, is possibly not doing what it should to address those kinds of lawyers, who generally those are the people who are approached by the poorest of the poor to deal with their problems, whether it's inheritance or eviction or divorce or whatever the case may be. And you get many of these lawyers stealing money. Road accident fund cases are a massive breeding ground for this kind of fleecing of the clients and the fiscus. And I don't think the Legal Practice Council is doing enough to deal with that. The standard of discipline and the speed of discipline, I think it's generally acknowledged, is not what it should be. It needs to do more to safeguard the public against rogue elements in the profession. But I do think that the standard of justice and the standard of lawyers, also many of them going to the bench as well, is comparatively very high in South Africa compared to anywhere in the world.
So what I'm hearing is that we have a very high standard at a certain level, and like all services in South Africa, if you go to the other end of the level, it's almost split by our Gini coefficient. It's the same as the hospitals, so if you're a poor South African and you're at the lower echelons of the economy, there's a good chance that you're going to get poor legal service, poor legal dispensation, the same way that you're going to get probably not such great help at your local clinic. And I just think it's incredibly interesting that you're saying that we're almost living in two separate South Africas. And it's quite sad that our justice system is now been polarized in such a way that it almost acts in two different ways, depending on where you sit in the economy and on your access to resources. It's something I don't know how we would solve. That I suppose is largely an economic problem, so I guess it would be out of your wheelhouse. But if I could ask very quickly, if there is a person out there that doesn't have a lot of money and they find themselves with a compromised legal representative, or they feel that the magistrate at the local court is somehow being bribed, or they're corrupt, or they're incompetent, what do these people do? What is their port of call? How do they stand up for themselves as opposed to having to just go along with the flow?
Well, the Legal Aid Board is usually the first port of call, but it's terribly under-resourced, and many of the lawyers are not haven't received the training that they deserve and that the public deserve. And they're understaffed as well, the Legal Aid Board. But there are quite a number of law clinics across the country, usually attached to universities.
Like the LRC.
You also have the Legal Resources Centre, Lawyers for Human Rights, the Socioeconomic Rights Institute, which do tremendous work in the realm of evictions, immigration, healthcare. Section 27 is another public interest law firm that does a lot of work in the education and health space. But they can't help everyone. They're also, understaffed in a sense that, the need is just so great in South Africa that they take on public impact cases that will achieve some kind of systemic reform in the different departments, education, health, etc., that will hopefully spill over and help a lot more people. But for the ordinary person who needs help with an inheritance issue, the options are relatively limited. They can go to these law clinics at the universities and get some help, but largely they're getting help from students, which means that it's not always the most reliable assistance, but it's what the current profession provides. The other thing is that the Legal Practice Council has introduced an increased minimum of pro bono hours for all practitioners, which I think will help to some extent. It is still a very relatively low amount. I can't remember the exact number, but it's, myself and a lot of other lawyers do a lot more than that.
It's a few hours a month, or
or even just a few hours a year.
Okay.
So it's a step, but I think the profession, like it did in the before there was a legal aid board, many people in the profession took on the cases of the underprivileged just as a sense of social duty, and I think that hopefully many practitioners will exceed the minimum pro bono hours and do what they can to help the public.
Yeah, it's very, again, very concerning, that we have these holes in the system and that the places for people to fall back on and get further assistance are so drastically limited. Just a very concerning thing. And again, the same way that we need to start concretizing structures to make sure that things are run properly inside schools and churches and scouts and stuff like that. I mean, it sounds like we need a huge amount of oversight and monitoring of these smaller legal institutions to make sure that people can get the kind of support that they need going forward. And again, like the issue with the magistrates court, it's amazing. It's just never on the political agenda because it isn't as exciting as, say, emancipation without compensation or, something much more catchy.
And it's also an extremely complicated problem, the magistrates' courts, from resources to training to discipline. It's a very complicated area that I think no political party can come up with very catchy solutions for. It's something that would take many years to resolve in institutional reforms and proper allocation of resources. So it doesn't make it the most attractive political proposition. But it is really at the front line of delivering justice to people, criminal justice, civil justice, and prevents people from taking matters into their own hands. That really is what the magistrates' courts are supposed to do. And
that's why when I started, I said, I consider your profession to be the last bastion. You're the guys keeping the wolf from the door, because when your conversation breaks down, when your role can no longer be withheld, the next step is acts of physical violence. That's basically how it works. I see violence as a spectrum for what it's worth. You obviously get at one end, you get things like institutional violence. They're quite subtle. It's difficult for people to see and recognize. At this end of the spectrum, you get nuclear warfare. And somewhere on this side over here, you get the advocates and the lawyers. And you are the last line in a country like ours, especially in a country like ours, where we already have a lot of political violence. We already have a lot of industry violence, taxi assassinations. I mean, there's chancellors in universities that are getting hits out on them at the moment. It's just incredibly scary to have to, face this kind of thing. And know that your profession is the last bastion before it goes pear-shaped, essentially. And knowing that it's to some extent at least, especially at the lower levels, the courts are under-resourced, the lawyers are often not properly trained, the clerks are overworked, there's not a lot of good systems in place. I know a small town I lived in. The town is not important, but it's a relatively prominent small town in South Africa. for about 4 or 5 years, no magistrate would go to the town at all because they said that they had safety concerns and they were legitimate. I mean, there wasn't even a fence around the magistrate's court. It was wild. And they built this enormous 100 million rand magistrates court to upgrade the system and get the magistrates back. It was 12 years ago they built that 100 million rand setup. Not a single magistrate has ever stepped foot inside that place. It's used for learners' car license writing. 100 million rand building.
Yeah.
And I think that just is in some way ominous of the poor distribution of assets, terrible funding systems, and just general disorganization. I mean, to have a big-ish, small, prominent town where magistrates aren't going through, they have the court cases in the next town over. It's madness, utter madness. It's interesting because the building's beautiful. The next thing I want to talk about, because this leads, again, straight into the next point, because now we're talking about this kind of thing, is a lot of you guys are getting assassinated. That's the truth. I worry about prominent players in the South African legal profession, especially guys that are dealing with really big, complicated, emotionally driven cases. I know that it's obviously more prominent for people that deal with criminal law. We've seen this quite recently. But I would just like to know from you, how do you view it? Do you feel that you are in any way at risk? Are there times that you think to yourself, this is a complicated court case, there could be nefarious players behind this? We are entering a stage where the assassinations and the intimidation and mafia-style oppression of our legal practitioners is starting in some way to look similar to the situation that political agents find themselves in places like KwaZulu-Natal, where councillors are being intimidated, threatened, murdered, and essentially the ability for them to carry out their jobs effectively is being somewhat stifled. I must say, if I was in a position like yours, and I don't want to send any paranoia into the atmosphere, but there must be something, some level of fear and anxiety around this kind of thing, if not for you, at least for some of your colleagues.
Yeah, I haven't been, for example, involved in major criminal trials. It's not an area I work in, and I also wasn't involved in the State Capture Commission, for example. But I do, have concern for those colleagues who work in those kinds of areas because, life is cheap in South Africa and you can buy a hit for 5,000 rand. It's the closest I've come to feeling any anxiety about safety is when I used to do a fair amount of domestic violence cases, and very often I would act for victims of domestic violence, and you have nasty characters on the other side, nasty men who could do anything if they lose the case and have a protection order against them. And one of the problems with domestic violence cases is that the police don't implement the protection orders. Women get killed despite having a protection order against the killer. So that's the closest I've ever come to feeling any anxiety about safety. But I must say it's not a prominent feature of my professional life. But the more you move into the realms of corruption law and particularly criminal law, then I think safety concerns will start to gnaw at you.
I just laugh at protection orders in South Africa. It's almost something that we do now for the detective that takes up the murder case. It's almost not something that you actually do to protect the victim anymore. You kind of do it in a sense to go, when the crime is perpetrated, we can find this guy. It'll be a little bit easier. There'll be a bit of a history. There'll be a note in the book. But in terms of actually instilling protection, I think a protection order is one of the most laughable things in South Africa. I know that it's something that has to be undertaken, that it's a necessary thing at a certain point. But I mean, at a police station level, it's really nothing.
Yeah.
I actually had a situation quite some time ago where I had to phone a prominent judge in South Africa. She actually worked for a long time at the LRC. She's one of the heads of the LRC. And I had to say to her, we've got this case, and, you know, what do we do? And she actually said to me, she said, you can get that protection order. She said, you can go through the whole thing. She said, I would recommend you do it. But she said, it's not going to have any immediate impact on the nature of the circumstances that you were dealing with at the moment. And I cannot tell you how disheartening that was. In the end, she never took the restraining order out, you know, and I think to a large extent that has to do with almost kind of victim blaming, you know, where you kind of not supported at a police station level when you go in and you want to make such a thing. You go in and you say, you know, my boyfriend punched me. Well, what did you do? You know, it's and that happens here. I mean, I'm not talking about you know, rural, outlying, small little police stations. I mean, that happens just down the road at some of our biggest, most prominent police stations. I'm actually fully aware of cases that have taken place like that. I've gone to a big police station with evidence to report police taking bribery. And the captain turned around and said, we don't do this here. This is not something we do. We don't look into other officers at a big prominent police station here in Joburg. Yeah. So now imagine if you're a victim of domestic abuse. I mean, the kind of misogyny, the kind of bigotry, oh man, it's not something that I would wish upon any South African. And given the state of our domestic violence problem in South Africa, this is an enormous issue.
Yeah.
People are literally being murdered because this mechanism is failing.
Yeah, absolutely. And it is at the police station level. There are also problems at the level of the magistrates' court, where a lot of magistrates don't always take domestic violence cases that seriously. They try to get the parties to mediate. The Supreme Court of Appeal has just issued an order saying that magistrates shouldn't compel parties to mediate domestic violence disputes, because it just enables the perpetrator, that kind of approach. It in fact gives them a win over the victim. So that's, I think, why only through systemic and comprehensive reform of our police in particular can we turn the tide in the fight against gender-based violence and femicide.
Yeah, I definitely think we need to work very heavily on quality control at the magistrates' courts and at the police station level. That's where the bulk of justice is dispensed in South Africa, and there needs to be a quality drive going on there in order to correct the problem. We going to cross over to a kind of different section now. We've been talking kind of about violence and politics and the legal profession for a while. We're heading into election season now, and I would like you to illuminate for South Africans that are watching on the issue of alienable versus inalienable rights in South Africa. And if you could just make a little bit of clarity for us on that. And I'll start with the example of Jacob Zuma just before Cyril Ramaphosa came in, where he came out and he said, free education for all, it's done, I'm doing it. Which was the call from the political movements inside the South African universities. It originally evolved from fees must fall, roads must fall, which came originally from the rape list at Rhodes. I was actually there, I did my thesis on it at the time. And Jacob Zuma fooled a lot of people. And he created a lot of turmoil by saying, education is now free. We've done it. We've heeded or we have granted your call, granted the wish of your call. And I don't think a lot of people realized at the time that in theory, education was always a right that they had. It was just an economic right. It was alienable based on the amount of finances in the system. It's not like the right to life. And I think that politicians play with us in the political field by the smoke and mirrors and the confusion between alienable and inalienable rights in South Africa. And I'm very worried that in this build-up to the election, we're going to see more campaigning like that kind of thing, where they're making big promises that are kind of hollow based on people's illusions around their rights. And if you could illuminate this issue for us and maybe explain it in a little bit more depth and clarity, so that if there's anybody watching, they're less susceptible to the propaganda, the electioneering propaganda that might come up around such an issue.
Yeah, so as you say, there's socioeconomic rights in the Bill of Rights, which a lot of countries don't have, like the United States, for example, where everything is left to the government to manage resources however they want. Whereas in South Africa, we have socioeconomic rights, which the state has a duty to take measures to progressively realize those rights within its available resources. So there's this qualification where the rights are enforceable in court, but only to an extent. You know, you can't say, I have a right to a house and I want the house now, or I have a right to have a dialysis machine, so I must get it now. What the courts have done is said, you know, the state needs to have a plan. It must be allocating resources, at least some resources, and the plan needs to be objectively reasonable. So it's very difficult. The most successful socioeconomic rights litigation was the litigation around the rollout of antiretroviral drugs, where it was found that the state's policy of not rolling them out was unreasonable. The more tricky cases are things like textbooks in primary schools, because the right to basic education is an absolute right. It's not subject to progressive realization and the state's resources. So textbooks in primary and secondary schools should be part of the bare minimum. And yet there's had to be so much litigation over just getting textbooks into these schools. Whereas the right to higher education is one that's subject to progressive realization and the state's resources. And the fact is we simply don't have enough seats in all the universities for everyone who finishes matric, let alone the money to pay the fees of everyone who can't afford it. So there is, I think, you know, people can fall for or be fooled by electioneering that says we're going to accelerate the housing list, we're going to do away with pit latrines in schools. But then when it comes to it and you confront the state, they raise the available resources defense. And you know, public interest organizations or law firms have to sue the state. And there's been long litigation over pit latrines where the state says, oh, it's going to cost X, Y, and Z. But that to me is not even so much a sanitation issue, which is subject to the state's resources. That's a right to life issue, which should be absolute. And yet the state fights with its own citizens on that kind of litigation, which is hard to reconcile with election promises. And this applies to, you know, whichever party is in government in a particular province or national government, that they tend to resist these attempts at enforcing basic rights. It's very problematic.
I've always been a heavy critic of the thing with pit latrine toilets, and Benny will know, the producer's in studio now, he'll know that I've used this analogy often and before, that any time the government turns around and says we're taking on this enormous complex infrastructure project, the car power ships or whatever, I always say these are the same people that cannot take a hole in the ground that's filled with shit, dump sand into it, and build a toilet on top of it. And these are the same people that we're going to give billions and billions of US dollars to run complex projects. And it oversimplifies plumbing. So to the plumbers and the contractors out there, I know it's not a little bit fair, or it's a little bit unfair, but the pit latrine toilets, it's just, for me, it's so ominous. It just highlights and captures South African incompetence in every way. I mean, they've been talking about this every single election year, everywhere since I was born. And they're no closer to solving the problem than they were 25 years ago. In fact, I've heard a lot of arguments for it being worse, that the population of school children has grown in South Africa, and actually there's now more pit latrine toilets being used than ever. I just think it's one of the most disgusting, horrible things. I mean, to hear of a child drowning in a pit latrine toilet, I mean, that should make South Africans absolutely outraged. It's just one of the most hectic things that could ever happen, and it's an indictment on South Africa.
Absolutely. It's an issue that, when, at the very least, when Michael Komape died, which was many years ago, he would have been a teenager by now. The state should immediately have said, we're putting an end to pit latrines in 12 to 18 months. There is the money for it. It's about allocation.
I 100% know that there is the money for it. You can just see where the frivolous spending is, and every time there's another like 20 million rand spent on another blue light brigade, nice Audis and Mercedes Benzes or whatever, 20 million rand for plumbing infrastructure at schools goes a long way. And again, like the issue with restraining orders not functioning properly, pit latrine toilets are not getting eradicated. This is actually, in a sense, it's manslaughter. I would describe it as institutional manslaughter. This now segues, again, I'm using the word segue too much, Ben, edit the word segue out. Leads us into the next question, which has to do with civil society. So we have, for example, Wayne Duvenage will be on shortly, and we've had this massive rise of civil society stepping into the place of government institutions to provide and have the provisions of basic rights for people. So, for example, we are now seeing that private institutions, say little bodies of farmers getting together, are now taking over things like waterworks in small towns so that people aren't dying of cholera. And I was wondering if you could comment on the tension in the space that has risen now between actors in civil society, guys like Imtiaz Suleiman, Wayne Duvenage, and government institutions that are supposed to provide these services, and how you see this tension playing out now and how you see it playing out in the future. Do you believe that these institutions will be increasingly more empowered to help South Africans with the basics that they need? Or do you think that the tension, the rising tension between these organizations and government institutions is going to actually stifle the dispensation for both organizations?
Yeah, I think we're at a very concerning moment where, we had the Marshalltown fire some months ago, and the government's first response was to blame NGOs like the Socioeconomic Rights Institute for, in their words, tying the government's hands, because the government wants to evict people from buildings that are unsafe, or whatever the case may be, instead of making the buildings safe, put people on the street. And these organizations resist evictions, resist also xenophobic victimization and deportations and that sort of thing. And so the government's response is to blame the NGOs, and then also to introduce a law that will monitor and restrict their funding, particularly foreign funding. And always, whenever a civil society organization is making a submission in Parliament or whatever the case may be about whatever issue, government says, well, who's funding you? Who's funding you? And the same applies to newspapers. And I mean, it's ironic because, who's funding the political parties? They've never been entirely transparent about that and resisted court cases to make them open their books and show who their funders were. So this hostility, I think, is only going to get worse as long as we have a government that is not prepared to engage in dialogue, in work together with civil society organizations. And it's been the case for a long time. The Treatment Action Campaign, for example, on the antiretroviral issue. I think that government needs to, whichever government happens to come into power, it needs to take a concerted decision to work with civil society, to turn down the temperature of the confrontation. They can only benefit from it. I don't think they're going to win any electoral support by targeting and undermining NGOs. That's certainly not going to happen. And they could even expose themselves to international condemnation if they continue with hostility to NGOs and to assign. We also see it in the environmental space, where the government obviously has committed to fossil fuels, and you have environmental NGOs who go to court and engage in protests and the like to assert the right to a healthy environment and say that we need to combat climate change, we need to move away from fossil fuels, and the government has been extremely hostile to them, and also corporate interests have been hostile to them. There have been environmental activists murdered. It's again, they ask these NGOs who's funding you, and ask these law firms who's funding you, rather than actually engaging on the issue and trying to find some kind of solution, a just and clean energy transition. It's very concerning.
As a mechanism, NGOs, again, they decentralize power in terms of that they decentralize resource distribution. And again, it just seems to be something that the ANC does not want. They seem to be heading for the seize the means of production, distribute everything centrally. And I think an NGO is a stick in their ideological means of production. I don't want to get overly politically philosophical, but that's how it appears to me that NGOs, they usurp some of the power from our political organizations, and they just don't like it, and so they resist them tooth and nail, and to the detriment of all South Africans. I truly believe what you say is 100% correct, that we can only benefit from an increased harmony and synergy between civil society organizations and actors, and government institutions, particularly our top political leadership. They just don't seem to want to work nicely with these people. And I am shocked, because some of these are just the most amazing human beings I've ever seen or witnessed in my life. A guy like Matjiu Suleiman, he takes no limelight. He has no ego about him. He just appears to me to be the kindest, most genuine, well-hearted human being that South Africa's ever had, and to not go and find other Matjiu Suleimans and say, how can we help you? Again, it just shows how incompetent our leadership is at the top. I would like to talk to you now about radical bulls before we segue into the pen. Edit it out. Before we move into the most controversial part of this discussion, I would just like to ask you again, because we're building up to the electioneering part of the year, what do you think of these radical bills that are coming out in the build up to the elections? And how do you think these are going to play out after the election? NHI, EWC. I mean, I don't understand, for example, how NHI could possibly work on a constitutional legal level. Bearing in mind, I don't know that much about constitutional law, but I don't see how it could possibly work because of things like the right to freedom of association. So if you could maybe pick out one or two issues that you might foresee such bills failing at the Constitutional Court because of constitutional clashes with some of these bills, and then explain, if you could, how they may impact the political sphere in the build-up to the election and afterwards as well.
I'm afraid I'm a bit ignorant on the NHI, so I won't really be able to help on that. But on the land issue,
That's the EWC bill,
Yeah.
emancipation without compensation.
Yeah, I mean, on the land issue, the government has had 30 years to address property rights and land distribution. And there's a clause in the Constitution that says, and it's section 25.5, that says that the state must take legislative and other measures to foster conditions to bring about equitable access to land. And this is something, there were white papers in the 90s of how to do this. And the land market in South Africa is institutionally unjust. You had 87% of the country's land taken out of the hands of black people and put in the hands of white and foreign interests. And one of the cruel ironies of the transition to democracy and the lifting of sanctions was that those who owned land, particularly good land rather than land in the homelands, which under-resourced, didn't have proper infrastructure.
Difficult to get agriculture.
Yes, yeah, very difficult, no proper irrigation and the like, is that those who owned good land and land with good infrastructure in the cities and also in rural areas that had proper roads and electricity and irrigation, their property prices went up astronomically. So the people who profited most handsomely from the end of apartheid were white and foreign landowners rather than black people. When we talk about the Freedom Charter saying all will share in national wealth and the land shall be shared among those who work it, that has always fallen to the back of the agenda. I think because it's such a difficult issue, but the state really, not only because of the constitutional imperative that it must do so, but I mean the historic mission of the ANC is land reform.
Yep.
It was founded, when land reforms were underway, principally to deal with the land issue. The phrase "South Africa belongs to all who live in it" was also a land-oriented statement. And nothing has been done. They passed laws to deal with restitution of land that was taken away during apartheid, and to prevent evictions of land tenants and people with insecure tenure to land. But to actually change the land market systemically to make it more accessible for more people, nothing's been done.
And this obviously destabilizes democracy.
And this is what's given rise to the clamor, the populist clamor for drastic measures to bring about land reform. Expropriation without compensation is really, firstly, an unnecessary distraction, because what the Constitution said and has said since 1996 is that land can be expropriated for just and equitable compensation. There's nothing politically or philosophically wrong with that if justice and equity is the standard. If you're saying you want to amend that, you're saying you want the state and the courts to be able to sanction unjust and inequitable solutions, which simply doesn't make any sense and would be unconstitutional if a law was passed to deviate from the just and equitable principle, even if in the circumstances it's next to nothing, the compensation. If it's just and equitable in the circumstances, because the land has been, you have an absentee landlord who has allowed the value to fall into nothing, then so be it, as long as the standard of justice and equity remains the yardstick for whatever compensation, even if it's minimal compensation. And it doesn't have to be only based on land value. It can also take into account how the landowner has profited as a result of no expenditure or investment on their own part. So because the state built infrastructure using the taxpayers' money, the state shouldn't then have to pay twice for that in the land value of what they're expropriating. But the other problem with the expropriation model is that then the state centrally has to take land from one person and give it to another person. So what we've learned from the Zimbabwean experience is that the state is ill-equipped and not to be trusted to do that, because deciding who to take land from first or at all can be influenced by corruption or naked preference or prejudice, and who to give the land to can be influenced by political connections and preference and prejudice. So centralizing land redistribution is not a sustainable project through expropriation and redistribution. What is needed is a systemic change to the way property values work, so that land can become more affordable for more people, and that those who own the most valuable land don't profit unduly from improvements in the investment climate and other things that they haven't actually invested in. They are reaping the profits of public expenditure and public efforts that they haven't actually earned.
Yeah, land rights or ownership, private property ownership is fundamental for most liberal democracies, because it has an economic implication. If you have investors that are worried that their land and infrastructure may be taken from them, they're far less likely to invest, which is actually a problem that we're having in South Africa at the moment, with foreign investors not wanting to open up and build, for example, factories with infrastructure. They simply don't want to do it while EWC is on the table.
Yeah.
It's quite concerning for a lot of South Africans. I think in particular it freaks out a lot of liberal South Africans, especially those that have benefited from apartheid, which is a lot of white people like us, and that's obviously something we can't get away from. But I am very concerned about the implications that it will have for the socio-economic landscape of South Africa if it is rolled out further.
Yeah, I mean, we live in a market economy world, and there's no escaping that. And however attractive the idea of a state run by the proletariat where everything is equitably distributed might be, it's simply not realistic. We will have a market economy for the foreseeable future, and it's about making the market economy work more equitably, just like we do with competition law. So you don't have unrestrained laissez-faire capitalism. You have competition law to make sure people act fairly and don't abuse dominance in the market. And in the same way, you can have state interventions to make the land market more fair. But the proposal of expropriation without compensation, it really has been, I mean, it's been done for populist reasons. It's an attractive catchphrase, but it has been a very costly electoral ploy, because also with terminating things like bilateral investment agreements, this has had a chilling effect on the investment environment, both domestically and internationally, of foreign direct investment. And you just look at the unemployment figures from when South Africa had advertised a market-based economy under the Mandela and Mbeki administrations, how unemployment was plummeting and economic growth was improving. And then from the adoption of more radical so-called economic interventions, including things like expropriation without compensation, expropriation of mines, that sort of thing, which came with the Polokwane conference when Jacob Zuma was elected. The investment climate has declined. Obviously, corruption and institutional erosion have contributed to that, but the unemployment figures have skyrocketed since then, and there's an obvious nexus between the two.
Meddling with private property rights in the long run is something that I'm very, very concerned about, like we have in China at the moment, where you have what I would describe as an awkward private property rights ownership model, such as their 99-year lease model. And it has been incredibly damaging, even though it's been one of the most successful economies, or the most successful economy in global economics over the last 30, 40 years. They are now starting to they're now starting to reap the errors of the issues around private property rights. But when you talk about regulation, there's a mathematical problem with all free market capitalist democracies. And that is the mathematical problem of numbers always accumulating in fewer and fewer individuals, which equates to the rich getting richer, the poorer getting poorer, and a widening Gini coefficient, which is exactly what we are experiencing right now in South Africa. And I seriously hope that the political leadership in South Africa going forward can really get their heads around this issue in order to obviously address the injustices of apartheid. That's obviously key, but also obviously not to destabilize South Africa's economy going forward.
Yeah, it's about reconciling economic growth with a concerted dismantling of racial capital, which racial capitalism was one of the foundation stones of apartheid. And it has to be dismantled, but in a way that doesn't compromise economic growth, that actually fosters entrepreneurship and investment in black-owned businesses, not through the state, but through the market.
You've got a huge amount of knowledge on the subject. You are read in various areas, which is quite impressive. You're able to speak on the social aspects, the economic aspects, the legal aspects. You've got a fascinating body of knowledge on this particular topic. We are running out of time, so let's head into the most complex topic of the day, which is something I know a lot of South Africans would like to hear from a constitutional and international legal law expert. As a disclaimer for people watching at home, I will say that you have been in some way involved in the reading of the legal case between Israel at the ICJ at the moment, between South Africa and Israel at the International Court. And I would just like to spend the last few minutes we have talking about Israel, Gaza, Palestine, talking about the human rights issues there. And what I will do is I'll start by giving just a brief view that I have, and then perhaps you can comment and give us a little bit more of a richer, in-depth analysis or provide a little bit more insight. I might lose a lot of friends over this, but I personally feel that the Israeli government is very, very poorly led. I believe that to some extent, Bibi Netanyahu is the C team of Israeli leadership. I mean, you have Nobel Prize winners, Jewish Nobel Prize winners in the country, and how he came to be calling the shots for me is somewhat disturbing. He pulled the troops off the border in Israel and was essentially using them to force people out of their homes, or allowing radical right-wing Israelis to force people out of their home and their land. And he moved his troops off the border in order to facilitate this. And the attack came. So I'm not blaming Israel. Hamas are a terrorist organization. I fundamentally believe that their doctrine is a murderous one, that they don't have a lot of ambitions for peace. And in some ways, I believe the same on the side of Israel, that they have no real intentions to stop capturing land in the region, to stop pushing people out of their homes, and to stop developing Jewish settlements, which is obviously highly inflammatory. So I would say, a large distaste for the actions of both parties on this side. And I feel that to some extent, the citizens of Israel and the citizens of Palestine are the losers in this whole thing. And that the narrative is being carried by right-wing, small groups of right-wing individuals inside these spaces, and that they have a disproportionate weight on the narrative. If they were electioneering, they might get 5% of the vote, but they spend 95% of the time in the media, And the other last final thought that I would have is that propaganda is a legitimate tool of war. And these are two groups that I would say are absolute experts in propaganda. They have mastery over global social media, information exchange, and they are dominating the discourse with, I would say, largely false or disingenuous narratives. And that's kind of my view and where I'm at. But given that you're one of the leading experts in constitutional law and in international law, if you could give us your view of the situation and maybe some solutions that you might have in your mind, things that you'd like to see, or how you may view things going down in the future.
It's obviously a highly emotive conflict and an intractable one in many ways. But you have to have a basic commitment from all participants to a set of norms. And the norms that we have are international law, international human rights law, and international humanitarian law, which is also known as the law of armed conflict or the law of war. So where you have people targeting civilians, you, on the one hand, you have an Israeli government that has been firstly engaged in a mass displacement of Arab Palestinians in 1948 in the Nakba, which was a violation of international law, a violation of human rights law and the right to self-determination, including many killings as well, violating the right to life. There's never been any accountability for that, and instead there's been an intensifying of the legacy of the Nakba with further encroachments on Palestinian land, illegal settlements, which are violations of international law, and illegal belligerent occupation of the small pockets of land that have actually been left or recognized as Palestinian, both under belligerent occupation and apartheid domination. Where you have such violations of international law on the part of the Israeli government towards Palestinians, it's no surprise, frankly, that you find resistance groups may very well say, well, if you're not going to abide by international law, then why should we? So many civilians have been killed, detained, and displaced by the Israeli government in various incursions over the past couple of decades. We always condemned by international lawyers and international human rights organizations, including the UN, where you have disproportionate attacks on civilian targets, indiscriminate attacks against military and civilian targets, and no accountability for it. Israel never allows independent fact-finding missions into the country or into the occupied territories. So when you're operating in such a way that you completely disregard international law, then why expect your opponents to operate in accordance with international law? That's, I think, a grave source of the problem. You have now Prime Minister Netanyahu saying that he won't accept a two-state solution, which has been the foundation of all peacekeeping or peace process efforts for the Middle East for many decades now. By saying there's no two-state solution means that Palestinians will never have sovereignty and self-determination. They will always be subject to Israeli domination, which I think is rightly described as an apartheid system of domination. The only solution is, I think, firstly, a proper fact-finding exercise.
That's where the propaganda's an issue.
Exactly, to determine exactly what has been happening. Then accountability, including criminal accountability for those responsible for massacres and other violations of human rights. And at risk of oversimplifying things, the most effective way to end Hamas, if Israel wants to end Hamas, and the most legitimate way to end Hamas is to end the occupation, is to end the normative basis that Hamas and the other armed groups have for their very existence and their political platforms. Without ending the occupation, you will never end armed resistance to Israel. And the politics of fear will only be a self-fulfilling prophecy. But I think eventually there's going to have, I think the court intervention was a necessary one in order to establish some kind of international law normative framework for what's happening. Some monitoring, some establishment of ground rules, because it's been going on for far too long. And it has to stop. It has to stop now.
I would say before we end the show, we've unfortunately kind of run out of time, and it's a pity because there's so much more rich information to come from you. What I see in the Middle East now is an opportunity for people to start relaxing their death grip on 2,000 plus year old religious doctrine and allow themselves to fortify their personal doctrines with some modern era international democratic human rights, if that makes any sense, that we need to start turning around and maybe ignoring some of the lines from our thousands of year old books and allow a little bit of humanity into our hearts and allow modern era human rights, universal human rights, to start displacing radical religious doctrines. So that for me would be my closing thoughts on the issue. I'm not anti-religion at all. I think that Islam is a beautiful religion with a lot to offer. So does Judaism. It has a rich, wonderful culture. But I often find that these conflicts are driven by 2,000 plus year old narratives where people don't want to allow the doctrine of modern human rights to enter the system and have an impact.
I think they can be reconciled. It's said that the golden thread running through every theology is the notion of treating others as you would want to be treated. And you find that in every major faith, including Judaism and Islam and Christianity. And I think that is in many ways one of the philosophical underpinnings of human rights and human rights law, is that you want to establish a set of rules and conditions that will apply to everyone, because I don't know where I'm going to fall in the socioeconomic spectrum, so I want to establish rules that will give everybody a basic platform of respect for their human dignity, their life, their liberty, as well as the opportunity to unlock their potential socioeconomically. So the idea of treating others the way you would want to be treated, I think, is completely reconcilable with human rights. And if you cut through, the rest of it, it's and connect with that theological principle, then I think we could have a much more peaceful and prosperous future.
With that insight, Jim, we have come to the end of our time. That is a sound bite that I'm sure Ben will isolate all on its own, and I think it's something quite wonderful for all South Africans to hear, regardless of where you stand in race, religion, age, culture, ethnicity. That is a fantastic statement that you've made. It is a mechanism by which we can draw harmony regardless of your outlook. I just want to thank you, Ben Winks, for your time. It has been absolutely fantastic to be able to see you again. It's been a really long time. It's been truly fantastic to have this discussion. I will continue to follow your career with great admiration, as will many South Africans. And the last thing, if you have any last final thought, or if you would like, if there's anybody that would like to contact you, maybe regarding legal advice or something like that, where they can do so?
Well, yeah, you can always find me on Twitter. It's just @BenWinks, or my website, benwinks.com, and you can see some of the work that I've done. And there's a lot of attorneys I work with who can form teams to help people in need of assistance. Thanks very much for having me. It's really been a wonderful discussion, and I'm very grateful for the invitation.
Thank you so much, Ben. And if you want to contact him, benwinks.com, or find his Twitter page at benwinks. Thank you so much for joining us. Catch you guys next time. Bye for now.